So I thought a little subdued monastic chant might be a good way to introduce this topic. So we're talking about the religious life in the Middle Ages. When I say religious life in this context, I mean people who took formal vows and joined groups separate from their families. Usually these people lived in communities, and they lived by certain rules or guidelines or laws, in fact, and they agreed to this. And the purpose was for their religious devotion. At least that was generally the purpose. There might have been other reasons sometimes too, but that was generally the purpose. I am outside today sitting on my deck while I'm recording this, so you might hear some birds chirping in the background or some noises. I hope it's not too loud. Anyway, just warning you. So I talked about this guy also in the context of the Second Crusade. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was a very significant religious figure of the 12th century. Okay, I don't have the dates he lived there. I should. He lived from about 1190 he lived from about 1090 to 1153. And we talked about him again as the preacher of the Second Crusade in the Crusades video. He didn't found this order, but he was one of the main people behind establishing this order as a very significant organization in the 12th century. And that group was known as the Cistercians. Okay? The Cistercians were a very strict religious order that followed Benedict's rule. We talked about Benedict's rule before in regards to early Christian monasticism. Well, St. Benedict's rule became the most significant religious text for people who wanted to follow a monastic life in the Middle Ages. Okay? So the Cistercians were a group of reformers originally who wanted to live a very strict version of the rule. They felt like that a lot of the monks had stopped living the proper way according to the rule, and so they wanted a renewal or revival of a more strict following of Benedict's rule. So they would often go out to places that were more remote and found new monasteries. Sometimes this led to people following them and new towns were established. They didn't necessarily mean for that to happen, but that is what happened often. So, the ascetic life. Remember, the ascetic life is the life one lives in order to downplay the body and uplift the spirit. So the ascetic life are things you do physically to, like fasting and praying a lot and resisting the desires of the flesh and these kind of things. Okay? The last part there is very significant for religious devotion in the medieval church and really influential to this day in religious devotion. The affective there is the proper word. Not effective, but affective. Affective in this sense means connected to the affections, the emotions. That part of the human body, that part of the human soul that has feelings attached to it. So they wanted a very affective meditation, a one that was a meditation on Christ's incarnation, humanity, and passion that reshaped the way one felt. Not just influenced your emotions or made you feel something, but reshaped how you felt and allowed you to focus your feelings on this more significant thing. Okay? So that's what I mean by that. That's Bernard over here. See the bee? That's supposed to be a depiction of Bernard right there as a monk. Now, there were also many women who became... didn't mean to go that far. There were many women who became nuns, what we would call nuns, in the Middle Ages. Some of them became writers and theologians on their own. And I like to mention this one because she was very famous in the 12th century. Very famous in her own time. She was well known. She corresponded with kings and rulers She even corresponded in her younger days with Bernard of Clairvaux. So she was well known as a writer and theologian herself. She was a mystic. A mystic is somebody, in this case, who has a spiritual connection with something beyond them. She believed that she had visions, that God gave her visions, and she wrote those down. But she also studied. She learned how to read Latin, as many nuns did. Nuns would have been the most educated women of the Middle Ages. That just makes sense because they had to pray and do the liturgy themselves. She also is well known for her poetry and music. Some of it is set to music, and you can still find stuff by Hildegard of Bingen. And you can tell Hildegard was by her name, you should be able to guess she was German. She was also a very significant abbess. A abbess was the female leader of a female monastery or a convent. Okay, so abbot was the male leader, abbess was the female leader, and so she played in the rough and tumble world of medieval politics herself. She had to defend the interest of her own convent more than once. In fact, moved it one time because she believed God wanted her to, and she did it going against the desires of some pretty powerful people. This is a very significant person. This is her over here dictating her vision to a monk who wrote a lot of them down for her. This is a fascinating image here. You see, there was a legend of the crucified Christ embracing Bernard of Clairvaux. And this is actually the front of a collection of sermons. You can actually see the word sermones there. S-E-R, you see that? And this is actually a collection of sermons, and it's the front page of that. And there was a legendary story that Bernard was meditating so intently on the crucifixion of Christ and the suffering of Christ that the crucifix actually came alive and embraced him. Of course, it's a legend, but it depicts this idea of this affective, this emotion-laden meditation on the sufferings of Christ. So let's move on to some other significant groups. So that was the 12th century, or at least the two I want to emphasize from the 12th century. Okay, we could talk about a lot more, but this is a World Civ class that covers a lot of things. So, two significant people from the 13th century who play a big role in changes in the religious life there. And the first I want to mention is a man named Francis of Assisi. It's my understanding that the current Pope, Pope Francis, took his name in homage or in respect for this Saint Francis. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what I've read. Makes sense, though. Francis of Assisi lived in what would be northern Italy. Assisi is a town in northern Italy. He was probably born around 1180, maybe 1175, somewhere in there. So that gives you an idea of when he lived, how long he lived. And he was the son of a fairly wealthy cloth merchant in northern Italy. Remember we talked about the development of the moneyed economy in the 12th century, where northern Italy had some towns that became fairly wealthy because of trade going through there. So the textile industry goes way back in those territories. But one day, he heard the Lord calling him, most likely through the reading of Scripture in church originally. And he believed when the Lord told the rich young ruler in the Gospel of Matthew that he should go and sell everything and come and follow him, Francis believed the Lord was talking to him personally. He wasn't the first person to do such a thing, but he famously did it. So Francis actually gave away all his money and inheritance. And he stripped down, I believe, early on naked, but that wasn't going to fly. And he put on something like this over here. So you can see Francis right here. Okay? And he Francis went around and started begging for food and preaching this new life of the imitation of Christ. Okay? And living a life of chosen poverty. Voluntary poverty. That's the key. And he went around rebuilding dilapidated church buildings. And all these other guys kind of got interested in it too, and they started following him around. So his movement that he started developed into what becomes the Franciscan Brotherhood. And these are mendicant orders because they begged. They begged in imitation of Christ. Again, voluntary poverty. Okay? The other mendicant order that started in the early 13th century was founded by a priest named Dominic. Dominic was originally from what we would think of today as Spain, northern Spain. And he founded a group that gets his name, known as the Dominicans, or Order of Preachers, originally as a group to preach against false teachers in southern France. There were this whole group, or thought to be this whole group of false teachers who went against the basic teachings of the church, and he founded this group of preachers to preach against them. They expanded into other areas, and his movement grew too, and they also, like Francis' movement, the Franciscans, were mendicants. Okay? They were mendicants. Now, over time, both of these become very established religious orders. They were mendicant orders. And to join them, you actually had to be quite educated and understand theology pretty well. Okay? And they also became very a big part of a couple of things going on in the 13th and early 14th century. One, many of the Dominicans and Franciscans became crusade preachers in the 13th and into the 14th century. Okay? So they were recruited to do those things because they were part of their mission was preaching. Notice the Dominicans are called the Order of Preachers. They went around preaching to people. Also, these groups specifically emphasize this very physical imitation of Christ. That's the whole thing about begging and voluntary poverty. And unlike the previous religious orders, the ones of the 12th century we talked about, they consciously went out to the people preaching. So they were evangelical in that sense, going out, bringing what they believed to be the gospel out to people. Okay? And lastly, as universities develop, which we're going to be talking about in the next video after this one, as universities developed, many of these men from these two groups became university professors, originally professors of theology. Okay? Oh, by the way, there were women's orders created too that followed these groups too. So there were female Dominicans and female Franciscans also. All right? So, let me conclude with this. The stigmata were thought to be a miraculous event where St. Francis received these marks of Christ, and you can see it kind of miraculously portrayed here, almost like little laser beams shooting into his feet and sides, where he receives the same marks that Christ received on the cross in his passion.